for 25 years now. I've been teaching at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas. It is the oldest continuously operating institution of Indian higher education in the United States. It started in 1884 in the bad old days of the Indian boarding schools, when the boarding schools were really the institutional mechanisms for, as Richard Henry Pratt said, he was the architect of the first boarding school at Hampton and later at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The goal was to kill the Indian to save the man. It wasn't a period of enlightened multicultural awareness. I think that's an understatement, but that's one way of putting it. Anyway, so for over a century now, Haskell has really transformed itself from being an institution that was about the complete destruction of people's nativeness, their language, their culture, their customs, their habits, their ceremony, their life ways, to an institution of higher education that tries to prepare Alaska Natives and American Indian students to be really very active in this very modern technological world, such as we've seen two really incredible examples of, but doing so while bringing very much with them an awareness, an acknowledgement, and a continued lifeway practice of who they are as White Mountain Apache, as Passamaquoddy from Maine, as Miccosukee, Seminole, Lummi from the Northwest Coast, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota speakers of the Northern Plains, or like my relatives from the Southeast removed to Eastern Oklahoma, you know, Zoyaha, Yuchi, Muskogee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee. There are over 570 federally recognized Native nations in the United States. That also includes villages of the Alaska Native corporations that were formed after the Alaska Land Settlement Claims Act in the early 70s. And so we're a national institution, international really. We have students come from all of those nations to Haskell Indian Nations University. And I think any given semester, I should have checked before I left, but I know typically we have somewhere between 140 nations represented on our campus. About 7 years ago, we had 178 nations, Alaska Native villages and American Indian nations represented on our campus of about 1,000 students. And so I guess being there teaches us something about hope, because when Edward Curtis was going through the West, including California, taking pictures of what we were known as at that time, you know, the very beginning of the 20th century, the vanishing Americans, I guess I can be thankful for the fact that we're still here, that we didn't vanish. And it does teach something about hope. So I don't want anyone to think that I'm anti-technology, anything but that. But I think part of the challenge that we have today is to recognize that when we talk about the kinds of problems that we're facing on planet Earth, that it's not entirely clear that the solutions can be solved with technology. That technology is a very important part of it, but it may get to some more fundamental issues of life ways, how we live as humankind. And what I would like to do very briefly is suggest to you that when we look at the environmental degradation on the planet, the lack of the continuing rapid decline of biodiversity on the planet, the melting of the Arctic ice sheets, that one might begin to pose this problem like this. you know, the kind of culture, the kind of civilizations that have produced these problems continue to develop and put such great faith in technology, you know, an idea that sometimes is referred to as progress, that we might be looking in the wrong place for solutions, for some exercises of indigenuity that I think we need to apply today. And I would suggest to you that there's a tremendous wisdom, a tremendous practical knowledge that resides in indigenous peoples today on the planet, and it's not too late to respectfully examine that, to begin dialogues with indigenous people around the planet about maybe lessons some of humankind never had a chance to learn, that some of humankind sort of passed over very, very quickly. And in the last 500 years of colonization, sort of missed the opportunity to see that the biological diversity of the planet is explicitly tied to the cultural diversity that's represented among humankind on the planet. I think what Mother Earth might be trying to tell us right now is that we can't find a one-size-fits-all cultural solution for the problems we face on the planet. In fact, I find hope in the fact that we can still look in many indigenous traditions. Here's a place where I always have to make a very fundamental disclaimer, too. Occasionally, someone will introduce me, oh, we're going to have Dr. Dan Wildcat, and he's an expert on American Indians. There is no such thing. If anyone gets up and presents themselves as an expert on American Indians, I would say, ask for your money back and then, you know, pack up and leave. We are too diverse. We are incredibly diverse peoples on this planet. And there is no, quote, expert on this incredible diversity. All we can do is suggest what this means and why it's very relevant to hope for humankind at this point in Earth history. So I'm not an expert. I'm not even fluent in my language. I do have to tell you a little story right now, though. Again, it's about resilience. It's about hope. It's about action. See, I'm not sure that hope precedes action. I'm not sure that hope precedes experience. It's not clear to me that as we live our lives and as we engage with the world around us, that hope resides in the fact that we anticipate results of action, how we look forward to something happening as we do something, as we live our life, as we get out of bed in the morning. I don't know, I was thinking about that this morning. I had a very late trip. I wondered if I got up with hope this morning. I'm not sure, but I know that second cup of coffee really helped. There's a little biochemical process going on there, I suspect. But this weekend, 10 years ago, if you had asked me about the future of the Yuchi language, so Yaha language, we're very small people. Our membership is really hundreds of recognized members of our people, the Yuchi, who are recognized as a part of the Muskogee, the Creek Nation. 10 years ago, we had less than a half dozen native speakers, fluent speakers, let me say fluent speakers of the Yuchi language. And four of those 6 were relatives of mine. 2 are now have started their journey to the stars, Addie George and Mose Kawi, but my 2 aunts, Josephine Bigler and Maxine Barnett, and others 10 years ago said, we've got to do something to make sure this language doesn't go away. And they started meeting, and they started speaking the language. And then they started recruiting young people, and then they started teaching Yuchi language in the daycare facilities with children. I just came from a Uchi festival in Sapulpa, Oklahoma, Saturday, where I was honored asked to participate. And the hope that I experienced that day was of those anticipated results of action. I saw 5, 6 young men and young women, probably late teens, early 20s, who can now speak Uchi nearly fluently and tell traditional traditional stories. They've been students of the language. They've been working with the elders. And I tell you what, that gave me hope. If you had asked me 10 years ago, would we still have the language? You know, I'm not so sure I would have been optimistic about it. So what kind of actions, what kind of activity do we need? Again, Oren Lyons on the 25th anniversary of Earth Day joined a group of Native people on the ellipse across from the White House. My friend George Godfrey and I were a part of the program there too. Oren Lyons is a faith keeper. He's Onondaga, adopted by the Mohawks to serve in their longhouses as a ceremonial leader. And Oren Lyons said, you know, here's the difference between Haudenosaunee or Iroquois views of the natural world and Western views. He says when Western people start talking about nature, they start talking about resources. We have no word for resources in our language. We have words for relatives. He said, be careful about how you use words. He says they can be very powerful. And he says it makes a big difference whether you look at the earth, the water, these mountains, the trees, the plants, and animals around you as resources, or whether you recognize them as relatives. You want to try a fundamental paradigm shift, one that I think that would be very useful and practical today. I would say we need to back away from a very dominant and power worldview that acknowledges and views the balance of life other than ourselves as resources, and reconstitute older indigenous ways of thinking about nature that acknowledge that this life that surrounds us consists of relatives. We'd live our lives much differently. And that's exactly what we need to do right now. We need to use the technology we have and this knowledge, but think of how we would apply that technology if we started thinking in terms of relatives as opposed to resources. I don't think that's romanticism. I call that indigenous realism. And I think that's what we need a good dose of, indigenous realism. We'll call this the 4 R's. That's the first R of indigenous education. The second R is respect. Once you're introduced to relatives, then you have to show respect. It's important. I mean, you know, if you start treating your aunts and uncles like ATM machines, you know, you're going to get put in your place in my family. You just don't show up when you need money. That's disrespectful. And, you know, we've sort of lived like that on the planet. Nature's the big empty ATM machine. Let's withdraw something out of it. We haven't been putting much back. We haven't been showing any respect. If we can show respect, I believe what we will begin to see is that we are involved in sort of these symbiotic systemic reciprocities. That's the third R, recognizing that, you know, the kind of who we are as humankind is very much not just a biochemical, physical phenomenon, but it's a cultural issue also. And I think somewhere along the line we've been miseducated by this notion. You know, you can do a lot of things with a nature-culture dichotomy, but in the big picture, that dichotomy may be miseducative. Because I would suggest to you that the power of indigenous patterns of thought lies in the fact that we took our food, our clothing, our dwellings, our language, our symbolic, our ceremonial features, even our social organization. What are the clans among the Yuchi? The wildcat, the alligator, the deer, the wind. We acknowledged in even our social organization this relatedness. And we established protocols and responsibilities we had to do, that we had to maintain to be respectful in this kind of life system we're a part of. So I think that these reciprocities are really important, and that what we need to start thinking about today, as we start thinking about all kinds of applications of technology, and particularly buildings and architecture, one of my major interests, is that let's get real. Why should we expect people to not think in boxes when we spend our whole time inside spaces like this? Look around you. Where are we? We're in the middle of the box. I think what we need to do is to reconnect in very practical ways, human life ways, to the landscapes where people call home. Indigenous people still hold that knowledge. We shouldn't all live the same way. We shouldn't all dress the same way. The notion that there's one advanced super idea of civilization that we should apply all over the planet may be the problem. That what we've got to reconnect is ourselves, our human selves, in a very symbiotic nature-culture nexus. One that's constantly interactive, full of reciprocities. If we do this responsibly, I just threw in another R. I don't know why these R's keep popping up. Okay? I had 4, now I've got 5. If we think about relatives in this life, if we think about respect, if we pay attention to these reciprocities we are a part of in this complex life system of planet Earth, and if we exercise responsibility, hope resides in the fact that we have a great capacity on this planet for resilience. Resilience. The choices we make do matter. And what I've been suggesting is that what we need to do is we need to replace this sort of worldview of fear that exists on the planet today. And we need to replace that. This does start to sound like the audacity of hope, doesn't it? Or someone just wrote a new book called The Mendacity of Hope. Well, I don't know. Anyway, but I think hope is important. Hope is important. And what I would suggest, if we could move from fear to this other paradigm, that what we would benefit from is we would no longer be so concerned with homeland security, but what we could develop and foster is a sense of homeland maturity for people on the planet. A sense of maturity about what it means to be humankind and how our lives are bound up with the other than human lives we share this planet with. I don't call that romanticism, I call that indigenous realism. And if we can exercise indigenous ingenuity, or as my student Curtis Kakava wrote in a philosophy paper for me 6 years ago now, he says, I think what we've been talking about is indigenous ingenuity. And then he did what any brilliant undergraduate student would do. He collapsed them and said, we're talking about indigenuity. We need radical exercises of indigenuity. And I'm not too worried about progress. I suggest maybe in place of progress, since it has such incredible baggage, cultural baggage with it, that let's talk about creating systems of life enhancement that aren't all about us, but about life on the planet. And that little role, and crucial but important role, we could play in this beautiful life system that we're one small part of. For me, that's hopeful. Thank you very much.